Buying a business without the proper evaluation is the fastest way of losing your investment. Not because the business looked bad, but because the numbers were misunderstood and not properly structured. Many businesses look profitable on papers until you examine what's exactly happening behind the scenes. So today in this video, I will walk you through how to evaluate a business before buying and the financial red flags which most of the buyers ignore or fail to understand. Hi, I am Raheel, Sheikh, and at Acquisitions LLC, we help investors and entrepreneurs in buying, starting, selling, and structuring their new business ventures. And while serving hundreds and thousands of the customers, I have noticed that most of the times the first time investors usually buy the business based on the emotions, but not based on the financial clarity or a defined roadmap. So let's break down and understand how professionals can help you in evaluating a good business potential. So let's start with the financial statements. So whenever you are considering in buying an existing business, so make sure that every single business must provide you a clear profit and loss statement, a balance sheet, and a cash flow statement. Those are the three basically blood veins of a business. And if the seller refuses to provide or unable to provide, you just need to walk off the deal, probably until and unless you identify some other triggers where you can evaluate those kind of financial numbers. So here let me put a disclaimer that many businesses, they run very profitable, they run very successfully, but they are very weak or poor in terms of the financial reportings or the sheets. So that does not mean necessarily it's a fraud or it's something you need to run off, but that means it's a high risk alert. So you need to go further and dig more deeper for the due diligence process. Second category which you need to understand that you should be able to evaluate the exact net profits of the business. Don't just get impressed by the revenue of the business. So in order to understand the net profits, you need to understand the gross revenues, you need to understand the gross margin, you need to understand the net margin of the business, you need to understand the owner's compensations and all the different expense categories of the business. So sometimes, for example, if the owner is underpaying to himself and just to elevate the business profitability, but in general, that's not a real profit, because eventually you need to do the corrective measures and pay a justified compensation to the owner. And if that compensation reduces the profitability, you must take it into the consideration. The next section you need to understand very clearly the add backs. Add backs is a very strategic financial term. Many sellers adjust the profits by adding the add back. For example, personal expenses run through the businesses, or one-time business expenses, or the owner's salary adjustment. So these are the common types of add backs which people put it into the financials just to inflate the profitability. So add backs technically or from the accounting point of view, they are legally justified things to do. They are legally justified entries to do, but it needs to be justified and logical. With the excessive add backs can compromise the actual profitability. Because for example, if a business is showing you $150,000 as a profit, but making the right corrections in the add backs, the profitability amounts can change drastically. Next section, you need to understand and review the cash flow statements of the business. Cash flow, as I initially said, is the blood vein of the business, and it's one of the most important statements to understand and evaluate, because most of the times profits on the paper does not justify or guarantee the cash sitting in a bank. So the both are the different things. You need to understand and look in your cash flow statements, the monthly cash flow trends, the seasonal fluctuations, how does the business performs in the different seasons. You need to understand the outstanding liabilities of the business and any loan obligations if the business have, because cash flow determines the business survival, not only the accounting profit. So cash flow is something which you definitely need to understand for the business. Next, very important sector which you need to understand, the client or a customer concentration into the business. So for example, if the majority of your business revenue or even 35 to 50% of the business revenue comes from one customer, that's a highly customer concentrated business. That's a very big red flag, because if that client walks off, your business loses the money. The next item which you need to understand while buying the business is to verify the actual real expenses of the business. So for example, there can be many scenarios where a business needs a particular maintenance or a high volume maintenance or a restructuring, but that is been deferred by the seller just because he want to get an exit from the business, and that can actually cost you a lot of money once you take over and want to continue the operations of the business. So anything with regards to the deferred maintenance or equipments and tools which requires the immediate or a coming future replacements, or even the understaffed operations, because maybe the seller currently doing a full-time job in a business and he's struggling hard and he's making understaffed operations, then that can inflate the margins and the profitability, but that is a big red flag. At the same time, you need to understand and evaluate the unreported or undocumented payroll obligations or any other liabilities and a vendor and a supplier obligations in the market, because all of these future expenses can drastically reduce your profitabilities once you acquire. The next item which you need to review is your lease arrangements. This is the most commonly ignored item in terms of buying a business, but it can actually and directly impact on the business valuation. So you need to look at the different terms like what are the tenure or the term left on the lease? Is it renewable? What are the rent escalation clauses? And what are the lease transfer restrictions? So those are the items which you need to understand before you actually commit or sign a business sale purchase agreement. The next item which you need to understand is the overall market dynamics of the business. So not necessarily if the business has been making profit now, it will continue making profit in the future. Maybe the market dynamics are changing, maybe the product demand is changing, maybe it was a seasonal or occasional product-based business which has been, for example, a Christmas related business which can generate a high amount of profits by selling the Christmas products, but that does not mean that it will continue the same potential and the same profitability for the rest of the year. So that's more like a mom and pop kind of stores and the shops and businesses. So it definitely do not continue for the whole year long. And lastly, some of the non-financial related red flags which you also need to consider. Number one of that is higher employee churnouts, like the employees are rapidly coming and growing into the business. They have a poor customer satisfaction. Check their Google reviews, check their Trustpilot reviews, see how the people are perceiving the business and what they are talking about about the business. You need to also understand that is the business operations dependent business or an owner dependent business. And lastly, the vendors arrangements and the vendors the agreements. How are your relationships between the vendors and your the payment terms with the vendor? So those are all the elements which you need to understand and evaluate before you buy a business. And one more important thing which you need to make sure that these all the due diligences is not a way to understand or reject a deal, but it's a way to estimate the risk and make a well-informed decision about your next big investment. So if you are considering in buying a business or evaluating a business and you want a professional help and guidelines from a team who can handhold you and navigate you the whole process, feel free to reach out to us. Me and my team would be happy to address all of your concerns. Thanks so much. Take care. Goodbye.